Hi, welcome to Dr. Catherine Schmidt's Moving Through Cancer. I'm Kevin with My Victory, the online exercise platform for cancer survivors featuring more than 2,000 ability-appropriate exercise classes for survivors. In this video, I'm going to go through some demonstrations on how to do each of the exercises and the basic lift routine described for the first several chapters of the book. I'll demonstrate them with dumbbells, but you're welcome to start without resistance or to use common household items like soup cans, water bottles as your resistance. I'll do each of the exercises one time for 10 repetitions, but in the program, you'll be doing 2 to 3 sets. Follow the advice in the book for the number of times to do each exercise. With that said, let's get started with the chest press. So as we start off with the chest press, if you have access to a bench, please feel free to use it, but for demonstration purposes, we're gonna be using the floor because everybody's got one, but it also adds an extra component of stability for that shoulder where we're not gonna be going into any sort of deep ranges of motion where you may not have that stability or flexibility yet. So let's get down to that floor, lay on our back, and we're gonna go through a couple of key positions here. So what I want you to do is just relax those hands right onto your ribs, let your elbows go wherever they're gonna go, and then from there, knuckles are going to come up towards the ceiling so that your rings are facing up towards those rafters, okay? And that is going to be the basic position where your elbows should be. So we want those elbows at 90 degrees. We want those arms to be by our side in a relaxed position, not necessarily flared out into a T because that offers a little extra stress on the front side of that shoulder. We also don't want them super pinched in against our body because then our shoulders can't stabilize at all. So we want to be in a nice relaxed, some sort of a 30 to 45 degree angle away from the body. Knuckles are up, and from there, we're going to press those hands straight up. Okay, we're looking for an angle where our thumbs are facing our nose. If we go straight up over our head, that's not a bad option, but for just learning this movement and trying to stay without any sort of extra rotation, let's keep it consistent and keep those fingers facing our nose. From here, we're going to control that lower back down, trying to hit that exact same spot. Once you feel those elbows hit, you should have nice solid contact from that elbow through the back of the arm on the tricep and keeping that shoulder itself on the back side in contact with the ground. We don't want to see those shoulders pull up and away from the ground. Now, as we're going through some of these reps with body weight, I want you to practice this movement and get a sense for where that range should be, because as we start to add some weight into this, it's going to challenge that stability, and you may find those arms wanting to wander. So drill it in a couple of reps before you go introducing any sort of weight. Make sure you have the movement down solid. So let's bring in those weights and start to challenge this. So we're going to get back into that starting position. Elbows are off to the side ever so slightly in that angle. Knuckles are facing up towards the ceiling. I'm not letting that weight sag into the wrist. I'm keeping nice and strong wrist, knuckles up towards the ceiling. I press straight up. And then I want to lower under control, especially as we have weight. We're going to press and then control back down. Now, as we're getting back into exercise and as we're trying to strengthen those shoulders or even the legs as we lift things, we want to make sure that that lowering portion is under control. It's going to help add stability. It's going to add that time under tension to really teach our muscles and our nervous system how to engage and control that movement. As we're pressing up, we don't want to see those weights going in opposite directions or really struggling for that stability. We want to stay under control the entire time. We want to make sure that we're breathing. So a good trick is to make sure that as you press up, get a nice exhale out. It's going to help keep those abs on, which adds to that stability in those shoulders. Do one more rep. Safely put the weights down, so let them drop right down to your side, and that's the chest press. So our next movement is going to be a bent over row or a single arm dumbbell row. And there's going to be a couple different ways that we're going to go over how to set this up from the beginning, but there's going to be one or two very common themes that you will see or hear throughout the movements as they even vary, but the movement pattern remains the same, and that is going to be shoulder blade movement and trying to use your back versus your actual arm. Now, everything is involved. It's not to say that you're not using one versus the other, but there's a couple things that we want to focus on after we get set up to make sure that that movement stays relatively the same no matter which version of it we're doing. So to start off, we're going to need a dumbbell and then some sort of elevated surface, whether it's a chair or a bench, and then we're going to go through a couple of different versions with this setup. So I'm going to take that dumbbell in whatever hand I'm going to be working, and then I'm going to rest my knee on the edge of the chair and my hand on the other side. While we're here, we're going to make sure that we maintain a nice neutral back, That back leg is bent in a nice supporting position. The shoulder is kind of relaxed, but we're not letting the weight pull us down. We're staying nice and tight, and then from here, this is what I want you to focus on, is pulling the base of that weight to your pocket. What that's gonna do is help you move that shoulder blade a little bit more, squeeze that shoulder blade without having to think about it. And then the pull motion that I want you to think is trying to pull from the elbow, not just lifting the weight up. When we lift that weight up, we tend to pull with more of our bicep than we do with the entire arm and the backside of that shoulder. So to make sure that we're keeping this movement nice and smooth, pull the base of that dumbbell or that weight to your pocket, no matter which version of this we do. So if we change that chair up, we can go into a side-by-side stance, and that movement has slightly varied, but that pattern remains the same. Another setup is we can move that same side leg backwards, and this is gonna add a little bit more core stability as we move through. By putting us in this asymmetrical stance, it's gonna make us focus on balance a little bit and really get that core involved. And that's the bent over row. So we're gonna start working into the squat, and so for this, if you have a full-length mirror, it's gonna be a great tool to kind of figure out where you are in certain parts of the movement and if you're lined up correctly. Now, if you don't have a full-length mirror, we all should have smartphones at this point, so face your camera somewhere towards you where you can see or at least record yourself and then watch the video back after to make sure that you're hitting some of these key points. Now, with a squat, there's a lot of things that we're gonna go over that can either make it a very solid movement or you may have some areas where you're lacking. So we're gonna try to make this as simple as possible, give you some solid cues, and with that, you're gonna need some sort of device to sit on. So we'll say a chair for this purpose, but if you have a bench or a couch will do just fine, all right? But what we're going to do is set those feet about shoulder width apart, and we're gonna experiment with this, but for a nice starting point, start with those feet shoulder width apart, get those hands up, like the I Dream of Jeannie or in a zombies type fashion. So somewhere where those hands are up in front, it's gonna help you keep that chest upright, okay? From here, what we're going to try to do is reach those hips back slightly and then down like we're sitting into a chair. Now, this is where the chair comes in. We're gonna pull this right out here. We're gonna line up those feet. Try to keep those toes relatively straight ahead, but if you need to, you can flare those toes out slightly. Now, this is where I mentioned a couple seconds ago, trying to figure out and experimenting with that motion. So hands are out in front, on your shoulders, somewhere in front of you to try to help keep that chest up, sitting that butt down and back like you're sitting into a chair and then coming right back up. Now, as you're getting used to this movement, what I would suggest is trying not to sit and rock back, but more or less using that seat as an area to just tap, know where you're at, and come back up. Now, a couple of key points is play with your hip widths or your feet width in comparison to your hips, right? So the closer you are, the more knee dominant this exercise is gonna be. I personally have tighter hips, so I go a little bit wider with my feet. It helps me get those knees out over the pinky toes or over that midfoot. So that brings in a second piece of information is we're trying to keep those knees lined up with our toes. Now, we don't wanna necessarily send them straight over the toes, but we don't want them to collapse in. So as we're going through this, what you'll notice is my knees stay out nice and wide. And what this is gonna do is help us use our posterior chain, our glutes, and our hamstrings to help stabilize that movement as we're going through. Now, as we're going through and as we're strengthening, we can be going through this and tapping. Once we get comfortable, we remove that chair, and then we go through our normal body weight squats. And as you get stronger and more comfortable with the movement, you can even hold the weight right in front like a big goblet. We call them goblet squats, and you can go through and add some resistance. The big trick is going to be keeping that torso relatively vertical, right? We just don't want to be folding over and collapsing where we lean forward, right? But we don't want to be so vertical that we can't actually get down. Our next movement is going to be the lunge, which is a variation of the squat. It's going to be a single leg version. So we're going to go through a couple of different options, but we're going to keep that chair out as a balance point while we're getting strong and getting used to this movement. So one thing to be sure of is that we have something solid to grab onto. It can be a wall, it can be a chair, but we're going to line up nice and straight. Those feet are underneath our hips. We're going to step back into a position that when we lower, both of our knees and our hips are going to hit a 90-degree position. So we're almost making a square out of our legs. What we don't really want to see is anything too far spread apart and then we're gonna struggle to get back up. So we're gonna step back, lunge under control, use your hands for support, use them to lift up if you need to. And we're gonna keep that same concept from the squat, where we don't wanna see those toes or those knees drift too far over the toes, but we also wanna be able to look straight down and see our entire foot this whole movement. We don't wanna see that knee collapse in. We're gonna do all 10 reps on one side before we switch to the other. Now, one variation, if stepping back is just a little too much, once your foot is here, you can do what's called a split squat, which is a stationary version of a lunge, where those feet don't move, but you're still going through that pattern. You're using those hands to help lift you back up. Once you've hit 10, you're gonna switch up and do it the same on the other side. And as you're going through, if you're starting to get back into exercise, and if you're getting back into the lunge, if you start to feel any sort of discomfort or tightness on the front part of that knee, make sure that you're keeping your weight back just a little bit and keep that knee from shifting forward, and it should help with some of that pressure. Our final movement is going to be the deadlift. So you're gonna hear this queued up if you watch any of our videos, or if you're watching any other sort of professional, or if you work out with somebody. You may hear this as the deadlift, you may hear it as a hinge. They're all common phrases or terms that we use to describe when the hips are doing most of the work. So what we want to do is set up with our feet hip width apart. We're gonna bring our hands up. It's just gonna kind of help get our back nice and flat. And what I want you to do is reach those hips backwards and your hands forward at the same time. And then we're gonna pull right back up to standing. Now, one thing you should notice is that my knees are not locked straight, and I'm not driving the knees backwards. I'm leaving them soft, but I'm not bending them while going through this. I am not actively trying to bend at the knees. That is a big difference between the squat and the deadlift. So let's get back into this movement. Our hands are up. We reach that butt backwards, and we reach those hands forward. Now, if you're struggling with this movement and trying to get this down pat, and you're just seeming to lose your balance, we're gonna bring that chair back in. You can even use a wall, but we're gonna use this as a point to reach for. So what we wanna do is get flush up against it and take one nice step away. And from here, we're going to try to reach our hips backwards towards that chair and tap. So we can bring those arms back in. And what those arms are gonna do is, one, help keep our balance, but two, help us keep that back nice and flat, which is the biggest piece of that deadlift that we need to be focused on. So not only are we trying to make sure that we're using our glutes and our hamstrings, we want to make sure that our back is nice and flat, because when we bring weights back in, they're going to want to pull us forward, and we want to be able to keep that nice neutral spine. So a couple more reps here just to drill this in. We're trying to keep that weight very nicely balanced between our heels and the ball of our foot, if anything, more so through the heels than the toes. So once we feel like we're comfortable with that movement, we're gonna bring in a pair of dumbbells. We're going to let them relax just in front of our pockets. We're gonna set those shoulders backwards, get that footing, soften those knees, hips push backwards, back stays nice and flat. When we get about knee height or just below our knees, we're gonna pull back up. And if your range of motion is able to get a little bit lower, then by all means go for it. But just to get back into that movement and understand where we should be, use your kneecaps as almost a stop. And if your range of motion is only to mid-thigh, then keep drilling in that, and as you get stronger, that range of motion will increase. But again, we're really trying to make sure that as we go through this, that back is staying nice and flat, that core is braced, and that those hamstrings and glutes are doing all of that work. We should feel very little to almost nothing in the back. If you do, then you know that your back is probably rounded, or your balance point is maybe a little too far forward. Those weights are kind of pulling forward. It's gonna add extra tension on that back. The lower back starts to round out, and we're not keeping that nice neutral spine. So a couple more reps here. We're gonna come back through. One more. And make sure that we're coming up nice and tall. Safely put those dumbbells down, and that's the deadlift. Thank you so much for joining me today. You're an inspiration to both myself and everyone here at My Victory. And I hope as you follow Dr. Schmidt's recommendations that you live a fuller life filled with joy. Combined with a healthy diet, exercise can be very therapeutic. We wish you success. Have a great rest of the day.